All right, and we are live.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Sandra Bucerius. I'm the director for the Center for Criminological Research at the University of Alberta, and it is my real pleasure that you are joining us today for our first talk in the speaker series of 2023-2024. Before I introduce today's talk, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we gather today. So the University of Alberta and the Center for Criminological Research respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. And today it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Katharina Maier from the University of Winnipeg, Dr. Carolyn Greene from the University of Athabasca, and our own Dr. Marta Urbanik from the University of Alberta. Collaboratively, they are conducting a multi-year, multi-site comparative study on houselessness and drug use. And today they will be speaking to us on how to make sense of the changes regarding increases in crime, visible drug use, encampments, and social disorder that we've been witnessing in Edmonton's downtown core over the past 18 months. And so with no further ado, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope you can see this and it looks good. Yeah, okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Katharina Maier. I work at the University of Winnipeg and also want to acknowledge that we're meeting on multiple territories today. So I am located in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, and these lands are the heartland of the Métis Nation. And I also acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. So I'm presenting our talk, Drugs, Crime, and Social Disorder, Making Sense of Recent Changes in Edmonton's Inner City, on behalf of Drs. Carolyn Greene from Athabasca University and Marta Urbanik from the University of Alberta. And together we have conducted almost 500 interviews with people experiencing homelessness and people who use drugs across several cities and provinces in Canada. And our research looks at how street-involved people experience street life, drug use, encampments, and encounters with private security, law enforcement, and different public health agencies. So I want to thank the entire CCR for the opportunity to present some of our findings today. And as you can see from the title, our focus today is on Edmonton, but I will also provide some insight from our other field sites. Empirically, I want to focus on encampments and specifically on the factors which we suggest shape people's decisions to join in experiences within encampments or tent cities. And as I'm sure everyone is familiar with, encampments have received massive political and media attention over the years. And so I really appreciate the ability to do this talk today. And I see the preliminary analysis I'll be presenting as really a starting point for an informed discussion. And as always, we value your critique, thoughts, and feedback on this ongoing work. Before I get into my talk, I actually want to tell you my takeaway point for this talk now, which is that people's decisions to live and experiences in encampments are shaped and intensified by growing drug crises, lack of clean and safe housing options, and increased victimization and risk of violence. People's decisions to erect, join, and or live in an encampment are therefore inseparable from the social conditions underlying unhoused people's daily realities. So to give you a little bit more background on the study as a whole, so our larger project, the Canadian Crime and Homelessness Study, is a multi-site, multi-year comparative ethnographic project on homelessness, drug use, and victimization. The project started in 2019 when Marta and Carolyn first did interviews with street-involved people who use drugs in Edmonton and Calgary. And once we were able to resume in-person research following the COVID-19 pandemic, so this takes us to spring 2022, the three of us joined together and we conducted field work in Lethbridge. Since then, we have conducted interviews in Winnipeg and Brandon, Victoria and Kelowna, and Kenora and Thunder Bay, as well as additional interviews in Edmonton in winter 2023. So in total, we have conducted 485 interviews to date. Our fieldwork is ongoing, so we will expand our research to other urban and also more rural communities across Canada. All of our research is street-based. So this means that rather than developing a study that is based on participant referrals from community-based organizations, we use traditional street-based methods in our work. So in practice, this means we go to a city, we get a sense of the scene, we hang out in public places like parks, street corners, alleyways, to get to know people, and importantly for people to get to know us. And if people are interested and consent, we conduct an interview with them about their experiences and perspective. So our sample criteria are not limited to people experiencing homelessness and people who use drugs. We focus on people who spend time on the street or who live on the street. In practice, our sample, however, predominantly consists of people experiencing homelessness and people who use drugs, between 90 to 100%, depending on the city. I quickly want to talk about why we use this particular methodological approach over others. So there's two main reasons. Number one is we want to ensure our research is inclusive of people who use or access community-based supports, but also of people who do not access these sorts of supports. And this is important because through our research, we found that it is often the most marginalized people on the streets who do not regularly access community-based supports, and some people don't access them at all. And our findings also suggest that some people are less likely or might be less likely to participate if we went through a community-based organization. And we know this because we asked participants about their thoughts on our particular methodological approach and how they would feel about us going through a community-based organization. The second reason for this approach is we really want to be responsive to unfolding events and people's lived realities and needs. And this was especially critical when we conducted research in encampments, because we were able to observe some of the dynamics and how encampments look like and work in practice. Overview for the talk for today is I will contextualize our talk within the broader literature on homelessness, especially in Canada. I will give you a brief overview of our data from Edmonton. And then for the findings, I'm going to focus on life in encampments and the benefits of joining an encampment. This will be fairly brief, and then I will move to the discussion to talk about the factors that shape people's decisions to join encampments. So John Hagan and Bill McCarthy's research has probably provided the most empirically rigorous and fullest account on homelessness in Canada to date. They conducted self-report surveys with almost 400 street youth in Toronto, and they illuminate many of the daily obstacles for youth who are homeless: lack of food, shelter, employment, income, and dealing with drug use. Their work also investigated the relationship between homelessness and crime. And so they found that youth were more likely to become criminally involved after becoming homeless or street involved, which essentially leads them to conclude that it is people's location or situational context, rather than personal background factors, that determine or at least shape criminal activity. We also have Gates Foundational work in Canada on mass homelessness and youth homelessness. And then there have been several fairly recent studies that look at more singular aspects of homelessness. This includes Rana Singh's monograph on legality and governance within homeless shelters, Huya and Brawl's work on victimization, and resiliency among homeless women. We have Day's book on how homeless policy and practices promote exclusion and responsibilization. This is obviously just a few examples of the most recent homelessness research. So our work complements this existing body of work by looking at the lived realities of homelessness and drug use during what I would argue is really a particular moment in time, and that is mass homelessness, drug toxicity crises, and economic shifts post-COVID-19. And so through this multi-site research, we account for broader realities spanning provinces and cities, but also teasing out localized nuance that are particular to our field sites in regard to how unhoused people experience police contact or contact with health agencies and encampments. What I want to do for this talk is really focus on some of the more common experiences across field sites, but then also provide some insight into local nuance with respect to our Edmonton field site. So clearly, houselessness is not a new issue. It's been an issue of concern in Canada for a long time. We know it's really difficult to measure the true prevalence of homelessness, but we do have some estimates, which helps us understand the magnitude of the issue. So it's estimated that roughly 3% of Canadians have experiences of unsheltered homelessness. And then an additionally 15% of Canadians have experiences of hidden homelessness. So let me define very briefly what this means. So unsheltered homelessness includes people living in homeless shelters, on the street, in parks, in a makeshift shelter. And hidden homelessness means people who had to temporarily live with family or friends or someone else because they had nowhere else to go. We also know that unsheltered homelessness is especially pronounced for some groups who are at greater risk of homelessness. And this includes Indigenous people, women, youth, gender and sexual minorities, and recent immigrants. When we look at Edmonton specifically, here are the most recent numbers from October 2023. There are currently roughly 3,000 people experiencing homelessness in Edmonton. When we look at data over the years, we can see very clearly this increase in 2008 around the financial crisis, followed by a dip, and then again a significant increase starting in 2019 and into the pandemic years. When we now return again to the October 2023 data for Edmonton, we find that 56% are provisionally accommodated. So this includes people living with others or in transitional short-term housing. So in other words, they are housed, but their housing is very precarious and temporary. 22% are unsheltered and 17% living in emergency shelters. And it's really this 22% of unsheltered that is perhaps the most concerning because of its stark increase. So since 2019, the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness in Edmonton has doubled. And more recently, we're seeing unsheltered homelessness manifesting in the form of a growing increase of homeless encampments or tent cities. So homeless encampments, in short, are makeshift shelters that some unhoused people set up or use to live in homelessness together. We can differentiate between two types of homeless encampments broadly. They can be sanctioned, which means that municipalities permit their existence. And one of the examples from our field research includes Kelowna, where we find a sanctioned site, or unsanctioned, which essentially refers to illegal settlements. Encampments, as you can see by these media snippets here, have elicited really different reactions. So by some or by many, they're seen as spaces of crime, violence, disorder, unsanitary conditions, so essentially a risk to public safety and health. And the increase in public complaints about encampments in Edmonton specifically speak to some of these concerns. So just to give you some numbers, between January and June 2023, the city of Edmonton received close to 6,000 public complaints about local encampments. and this is up 60% from 2022. And we have seen many examples of forced encampment clearances across Canada over the years, and these are often justified with reference to encampments' public health and safety risks. Others support the toleration or even protection of encampments and people's right to erect shelter in public spaces. They say that there's a lack of shelter capacity and lack of affordable housing, and as such, it is a charter right for people to be able to erect shelter in public space. These are all positions we need to engage with, I think, and they tell us something about the public responses to encampments. But I would argue the knowledge base we have so far leaves unanswered one of the much broader questions, which is, why are we seeing this increase in homeless encampments as this more recent manifestation of unsheltered homelessness? And when we look at the existing literature again, we find it is only helpful to a certain extent. Existing research that explains increases in homelessness has looked at the interplay between macro factors and micro factors. So macro structural factors such as welfare cuts, social housing cuts, privatization, and more recently economic shifts during the pandemic are often explained to be behind unsheltered homelessness. And these macro factors then intersect with micro factors such as losing a job that puts people at increased risk of becoming homeless. These factors, again, they help us understand shifts in homelessness more generally, but they don't tell us much about the emergence of encampments as a manifestation of unsheltered homelessness. And one way to learn about shelters of encampments specifically then is to listen to unhoused people, why they join encampments and what benefits they may see in living in an encampment. So the research questions that I would like to touch on for the remainder of the talk is, how do unhoused people experience life in encampments? Why do they join encampments? And what are the factors shaping decisions to join and life in encampments? So I'll briefly give you an overview of the demographics for our Edmonton sample. And again, this is just winter 2023. And we're talking about 45 interviews here from the winter 2023 data collection. All the interviews we do are always audio recorded and transcribed. We offer all of our participants $30 for their time, and this is to show respect and appreciation for their expertise. The average interview time for this sample was 25 minutes. 90% were experiencing homelessness at the time of the interview. You see the participant age range here, 25 to 66, sorry. And then 64% of participants were men. In addition to the demographics you see here on the slide, also want to note that all participants in the sample were using substances at the time of the study, which included meth, fentanyl, and alcohol, and others. 44% self-identified as Indigenous, 33% were white, and there's some unknown data when it comes to the racial makeup of our sample. Okay, so just to reiterate again, the focus today is on Edmonton, but I will also provide you with some insight from our other field sites, and I'm happy to talk about the demographics from those field sites in the Q&A. So encampments obviously differ a lot. They differ in terms of size, they differ in terms of configuration, order, level of cleanliness, and toleration of drug use. And people, sometimes we found that people in one encampment have very strong opinions about people in other encampments and how other encampments work, which tells us something about the nuance that we need to be aware of. So again, for today, I'm just going to focus on some of the more common issues that we see across our field sites. Contrasting much of the media depictions, participants in Edmonton and across many of our other sites routinely described encampments as highly organized spaces with several informal rules or codes of conduct to sustain a general sense of order in the camp. And specifically, participants talked about the importance of roles, respect, and rules. So people living in encampments frequently take on different roles, and these roles are really meant to benefit the encampment as a whole. So we heard from people that they are in charge of going into the community to gather food and then bring it back to the camp. Meanwhile, it is other people's role to stay back at the camp and guard everyone's belongings. And that is a very important issue because theft or losing one's belonging is a major issue for unhoused community members. And as you can imagine, it makes life significantly more difficult. People in encampments frequently share chores. We heard of people saying they're in charge of picking up the garbage, picking up cigarette butts, picking up needles, or just generally maintaining cleanliness. And some people may also take on the role of mediator. So in one of our field sites, we talked to someone who self-described as the mayor of Tent City. And he was in charge of mediating dispute and essentially working on keeping the peace in the tent. Participants also talked about the importance of showing respect for each other. Joe from Edmonton explained, we try to keep a collective respect. The only things that aren't welcome are the ones that are really rude to everyone and that can't get it together. They're outcasted. Moving to another city in Thunder Bay, where we collected interviews across 4 major encampments, Jean said that respectful relationships meant being kind and respecting each other's privacy and individual struggles. She says, I try to keep to myself out here. Everybody's got their own demons they're fighting. Everybody's got their own walks of life. I try being as kind as I can. My mother always said, be kind always, because nobody's promised tomorrow. Camps also have different informal rules or agreed upon standards of behavior that people are expected to follow. And these include following up on Jean's narrative to respect each other's privacy, but also to maintain a certain standard of cleanliness in your own tent and across the encampment, to keep the peace, which at some encampments included curfews. So by 10 o'clock at night, everyone needed to be quiet and calm down. And perhaps most critically, not to steal from each other. Just don't touch what's not yours. That's common, said Pete from Thunder Bay. These rules are not only important for maintaining peace and order in the camp, but also to not attract negative attention from the public and law enforcement. Because as another participant said, so we can look good, not dirty and trashing stuff to the public. These rules and expected standards of behavior were also enforced on a daily basis. And I will talk about Mara here, also from Thunder Bay, who made this very clear when she talked about her experience living in an encampment. She started by saying, we're all family now. Like, we just don't like random people staying with us, talking about the importance of being around people who you know and trust. Asking what would happen if a new person wanted to settle with them, she explained, we would all have to say, yeah, if one person doesn't want you, then they can't. If one of us want that person to stay, then they can't. We all have to agree and be on the same page to let someone new stay with us. Going further, she elaborated on what happens when people don't abide by the rules that I just talked about. Now read this longer narrative. She's saying, we give them chances. So people who don't follow the rules, we usually give them 3 chances. 3 people were thrown out recently because they would get too fucked up on drugs and be too loud and yell around and stuff and make us look stupid. So we would tell them to pack up their shit and take their tent too and go, because they'd make us look stupid, because we don't want to look stupid. So we just need to tell them to listen and do what you're told, or get your shit and get out of Tent City. Get out of our squad and go somewhere else. These descriptions of life and order in encampments already tell us quite a bit about some of the benefits that people might find in encampment life. And I want to talk about 2 benefits specifically, although we could definitely talk about more. The first one is community and companionship. Ray from Edmonton highlighted that the fact that most of the people are familiar with each other in the camp gave her a greater sense of security and community. And Pete, also from Edmonton, explained the benefits of living in an encampment as you have people to talk to you and you don't go stir crazy. We look after one another. We all pitch somewhere. The second major benefit is a sense of increased safety. And this is in regard to three things: physical safety, property safety, and harm reduction safety. So Laura from Thunder Bay, when I asked if she felt safe in the camp, stated, yeah, I do. I got a lot of friends around me, so they watch over me. Some nights it's kind of uneasy. She explained that, quote, being bothered for reasons for drugs and stealing my shit was still a common occurrence at the camp, but being with people she knew helped. And so her narrative also speaks to increased safety for one's property. By having people watch over your things, protect them, you can increase the risk of being becoming a victim to theft. Harm reduction safety was another benefit. So at the camps, rules typically include to not use drugs alone, to let other people in the camp know when you're using drugs, to not bring drug-related beefs into the encampment, and to always have naloxone around. And so I'm going to show you Marcus' narrative. Marcus described himself and his girlfriend as the president and first lady of the camp. And he was also in charge of looking after people who were using drugs. He says, we always have naloxone around because a lot of people are ODing around here. People shouldn't do it alone. It's too dangerous. And Marta asks, is that a rule you guys have here? And he says, yeah. And checking on people. And he says, yeah, usually I'm the one. I don't use. I quit that shit. I quit that down shit. So Marcus explained that he was in charge, or one of his roles was to look after people and to respond in case there was an emergency and generally make sure that people were as safe as possible. The data that I've shown you so far may suggest to you, or may make it seem like encampments are safe grounds for unhoused community members. But our data suggests this would be too short-sighted, and it would be too simple to describe encampments as safe havens or to provide some sort of sanitized picture of homeless encampments. And that's for two reasons. Number one is concerns about safety prevail in the camps. So even though we heard about some of the benefits of living in an encampment, people routinely talked about the risk to their physical safety, property safety, and drug-related harms in the camps. Some participants stated that living in a camp was scary, while at the same time acknowledging some increased safety. Others talked about how they frequently felt creeped out. Some described living in an encampment as the lowest I've ever been in my life. I'm so tired of living like this. And again, other participants said that they would never stay in an encampment because this would be the lowest of their life and something they wanted to avoid at all costs. So these narratives and knowing that victimization, including physical violence, happens at a camp is important to recognize and to provide more nuance of some of the narratives I just showed you. Number two, we need to be attentive to some of the other factors that shape why people experience encampments in a certain way. So what shapes people's particular views of the benefits and life in encampments? And there are many factors we could talk about here, so I want to focus just on two for now. And number one is the lack of housing options, and number two is increased disorder, violence, and victimization. So in media and policy discussions, the increase in encampments is often attributed to a lack of available shelter space. Our data suggest that this argument neglects how unhoused people feel about and experience shelters and other emergency housing options. And so we suggest that unhoused people's perspectives and positive perspectives on encampments are at least in part connected to their negative and sometimes dehumanizing experiences with shelters specifically. I want to start with Don here from Edmonton, who said, I went to the shelters, and I tell you, man, I'm never going to go back there again. I found it very offensive. All I wanted to do is just ask simple questions, and the staff ignore you. What are the shelters like? We ask, and Don responds, just really cold and no communication whatsoever. You treat it like, you feel like you've done something wrong to be here. So there were many reasons to explain people's negative experiences with shelters, and some of these meant that they preferred encampments over the more stigmatizing shelters. And here I want to give you a bit of a taste from our other field sites. People's experience with shelters related to a lack of cleanliness, specifically concerns about insect infestation. Jude from Lethbridge says, there's lice, head lice, bed bugs, body lice. It's filthy in there, like the bathrooms are so disgusting. Concerns about losing belongings and theft were also dominant. As Aaliyah, also from Lethbridge, said, your shittle gets taken in a heartbeat at the shelter. Many of the participants felt shelter rules were unreasonable and unfair, and that at times staff enforced them arbitrarily. I'll give you an example from Jared, who said, staff find any excuse. Like the one guy over there, they kicked him out for the shower. The piping for his shower in the wall started leaking into the room below him, and they kicked him out, stating it was his fault, even though it was the piping inside the wall. So participants said they often felt the rules at shelters were infantilizing, but could also be harmful to their well-being, including their desire to desist from drug use. Jana, also from Victoria, said, the places they're putting up the homeless, it's so stupid. She talked about how she was not allowed to have visitors, friends and family come, saying that instead of going through a situation where you have support, you would go back to using and drinking or whatever. So the connection to encampment should be fairly obvious here. Our participants voiced the desire for shelter that grants somewhat of a greater sense of autonomy, certainty, and safety. Our findings here then echo Herring's argument that encampments can, at least in part, be understood as a sociospatial marker of distinction to what people perceive as the more stigmatizing shelter or the other quite limited housing options that are typically available to them. The second and final factor that shapes people's particular perspectives of shelter relate to disorder, violence, and victimization. And this was especially pronounced in Edmonton. So I'm going to focus on Edmonton for the last 5 minutes or so. I'll start with Jessica. So Jessica, at the time of the interview, had been out in the community for 3 months. She spent 10 months in jail, and she described her perception of Edmonton's inner city as follows. From last year, like me going to jail and then coming out, things have flipped. People are different. Everything's changed. I don't know. It's more scary now than it was before. And so Jessica's narrative is certainly not unique. And we know this because Carolyn and Marta conducted interviews in 2019 and then again in 2023. So we have this comparison, and we can see very clearly that concerns about victimization and safety are much more salient and intense in the 2023 data set. Participants described two reasons, interrelated reasons for this increased risk in violence and victimization. Number one is drug-related violence, and number two, the disintegration of the street code. So people in Edmonton frequently talked about how the drug supply isn't as pure as it was before. And I mean, that's really like a common thing across sites, that it is much more tainted with more chemicals and mixes. So I'm going to show you some narratives. Here's Rick, who's saying this insane drug. He's talking about fentanyl. And I don't know why the fucking government never jumped on their spaceships and army tanks and start fighting whoever's making it. We have Cross saying, the young people I see so messed up on fentanyl or crack or whatever it is. It's sad now. And lastly, we have Chase saying, people are more paranoid nowadays. People are more lost in their stuff and kind of like don't trust each other anymore. Here our participants explain how much of the violence and crime on the streets results from the need to make money, to get drugs, and to avoid getting sick in the case when drugs are not available. In this context, Liv from Edmonton described Edmonton's downtown like this. She says, it's very unsafe, even amongst your own circles, your own people, your peers. It's because of the drug. The drug itself has made people a lot more simple these days. And people are doing whatever they can to sustain that high, even if it means hurting the people they love. Liv said that she was very deep in her addiction at the time of the study, to the point, she said, she would have sold her grandmother to get drugs. She talked about increase in rage, the need to steal, anger prevalent on the street, overall resulting in greater distrust and paranoia among the street community. The second reason feeding into this increased sense of victimization and disorder and violence is the disintegration of the street code. So very briefly, street code is essentially a set of informal rules that exist on the street that typically provide a sense of order to homeless people and people who are criminally involved. So the street codes may tell you not to steal from each other. They provide rules around violence, such as that you shouldn't harm the most vulnerable, that people should work together, and that when you steal, it should be from larger businesses and not from each other or from the larger public. Participants in Edmonton specifically reported a disintegration of the street code, where these previously existing rules were no longer being followed, resulting in an increased sense of chaos, uncertainty, and distrust among the street community. And we can see this quite clearly in how participants described the disintegrating street code. Mike says there was a street code, there was old school, it was a set of rules put in place for respect, and then goes on to explain the street culture here in Edmonton is pretty well Deadmonton, no more nothing out here, it's everyone for themselves. Similar, Ivan said, younger people don't respect themselves and they have a hard time respecting anyone else. When we put this together, the lack of housing options result in increased uncertainty, anxiety, stress, and increased victimization, as well as this increased disorder, violence, and victimization. We can see how the outcome is a generalized safety concern and heightened safety concern for people living on the streets. And so I want to leave you with two quotes. One is from Melissa from Edmonton, who in response to being asked about how she feels in downtown Edmonton, she said, I pretty much get there and get what I need and get the fuck out. It's dangerous there. We see similar discussions and feelings about victimization violence in the inner city across our field sites. And I'll end with my hometown in Winnipeg, where people reported frequent drug-related violence and generalized sense of insecurity and fear on the street. Like Eddie, who said, it's crazy over there, and he's talking about sort of downtown Winnipeg, there's too much drugs and shit like that. They'll jump at you for no reason. So how are these factors then related to encampments? So participants across our field sites often referred, as I said, to the moral and material benefits of encampments. And many experience them as preferred safe grounds that offer various benefits. But as I also said, it shouldn't lead us to conclude that encampments are wholly safe and beneficial spaces. Rather, the benefits people see in encampments must be contextualized within broader shifts in drug crises and violence and victimization for unhoused people. We suggest that some of the reasons why people join encampments are related to other experiences of street life, and that in particular, increased concerns about safety and drug-related harms are connected to or can explain, at least in part, why some people see benefits of living in homelessness together. In other words, we can see encampments as an adaptive strategy in the broader context of an intensified drug crisis and increased sense of violence and victimization. For us as researchers, then, it is critical we investigate why people join encampments, why they choose living in homelessness together over other options, and to recognize the factors underlying people's decisions to live or join an encampment. So for the last minute, I just briefly want to touch on policy flowing from our research. And there's obviously these long-term policy suggestions that flow from our findings, and they're certainly not new, but I think they bear repeating. Number one is housing. The point is that simply increasing shelter capacity is definitely not enough. We need housing that responds to unhoused people's concerns about safety, victimization, hygiene, and rules. We need a safe drug supply, which has the potential to reduce crime, violence, drug trafficking, and critically, to save people's lives from toxic drug overdoses. This needs to be embedded within a multifaceted collaborative strategy that prioritizes mental health and addiction treatment. And at the same time, we need to focus on some of the things that could be done perhaps more in the short term, because we know that encampments are not going to go away in the short term, and we need to consider how to respond to them. And this includes for municipalities to consider whether cities have sanctioned versus illegal encampment settlements. What we've seen in our research, that it is much easier for municipalities to provide services, for example, in sanctioned sites. And we see across our field site that having services at these sites can alleviate at least some of the struggles homeless people experience on a daily basis. Lack of drinking water, lack of portable toilets, lack of lockers to store their belongings, and lack of internet access were only some of the things people in encampments noted, which made their life more difficult and which also made it more difficult for them to find pathways out of homelessness. So thinking about short-term solutions to create encampments that provide safety and order for the people living within an encampment and also for the wider public is crucial. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katharina, and also Carolyn and Marta for the fascinating talk. As people are gathering their thoughts, I just want to explain the Q&A. So you can either raise your hand here and if you feel comfortable, turn on the camera to ask your question. I will make sure, or I will try not to miss anyone. And then you can also, if you feel more comfortable, typing your question into the chat. Jeff or I can read it for you, or you can, if you're on the YouTube channel, type your question directly into the YouTube channel and we will ask our speakers. So those are all the different options. And I will see if anyone has a question here on the Zoom call. Anyone want to go first? Kevin, okay. You need to unmute yourself.
I think there's something in the chat first.
Okay, so in the chat, it says, Katharina, thank you for that presentation. I'm just wondering where you see colonialization and racism as fitting into the micro and macro reasons you listed as underlying homelessness. I didn't hear much about those in the presentation.
Carolyn, would you want to take that because you were in the scene in Edmonton?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, these things are inextricably connected. I think all of us would agree with that. Indigenous persons are definitely overrepresented in Edmonton and in just about every other site we have done field work in. In terms of the impacts, I mean, that overrepresentation speaks for itself, I think. I don't know what more to add to that.
Okay. Does Katharina or Marta want to add anything, or should I go to Kevin?
Yeah, I'll add something. Thank you for that question. It's really wonderful. It's definitely something we contend with in much of our work. Definitely racism, colonization, all of those things form the foundation of many of our participants' experiences. And what we do find is that with Indigenous participants in particular, some of the trauma trails of colonialism specifically are much more exacerbated and pronounced for them. So oftentimes the stories that we will hear in cities where there is a disproportionate amount of Indigenous people on the streets, such as in Edmonton, are much more horrific and much more lengthy than cities where there are far fewer participants that are of Indigenous background, such as I'm thinking specifically of Kelowna in this situation. What these things do oftentimes is they kind of shape the street structure. And in some ways, they provide additional safety to people on the streets because it allows for these kind of really familial bonds. And I'm using familial here in like the broadest sense that many Indigenous people see. But it can also, unfortunately, complicate things because, of course, the trauma that is compounded can contribute oftentimes to some of the street-based violence that we see. What we did anticipate we were going to see in Edmonton was quite a bit of colonial violence, specifically from the systems most often associated with that, such as with policing. In our data, that didn't come out as much as we anticipated that it would. And so it really shapes things both positively in that sense, but can also shape things in really negative ways for other elements. So I hope that's a bit greater context.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and then I have Kevin and then Harvey.
Great, thanks for that. I've heard you guys, or I've read some of this stuff, but I haven't seen you folks present on it before. So this is really just open for anyone of the team. So I've been reading. I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce his name correctly. Sam Quinon. So I don't know if you know his book. He's a drug researcher. He's been doing drug research in the United States for about 25 years, and he's got a new book out called The Least of Us, studying roughly the same type of population in the United States. And his conclusion is that the street problem can no longer be understood as a housing problem. He says, in fact, in the studies, the cities that he's studied, there is ample housing that people are just not willing to live in. And this is housing that is clean, that is available, that is open. But because of a whole series of dynamics related to street culture, not needing to be or wanting to be close to the drug scene, not wanting to leave their stuff behind, all kinds of things like that, that in fact, they simply do not want to and will not leave the street, even when there is housing. And I just wondered, does this map in any way, I mean, his research is all in the United States. I'm just curious, does that map in any way onto things that you folks are hearing or seeing?
I can start with that. It's a good question, and it does and it doesn't. So it doesn't in the sense that in some cities there simply doesn't seem to be sufficient affordable housing. So I'm thinking of Kelowna specifically, where people said we simply can't afford the rent here. Similarly, in Thunder Bay, people talked about increased rent prices, which made it very difficult, even with certain jobs, to afford an apartment. Then even when there is housing available, it often comes with rules that people at times may not want to abide by or find it very difficult. And so even when people are housing, it often feels to them as very transitional. They know they can be kicked out, and they are still under supervision and just sort of this array of rules, which can make it very difficult to feel secure in where they live. I would agree with the claims in the sense, though, that homelessness and drug use really intersect, and that we cannot no longer talk about homelessness without talking about toxic drug crises and other factors like victimization. So we are sometimes asked, because we talk about street-involved people and we say many of our people are unhoused, some use drugs. We're obviously, this is not the same population, but in our research, many people were unhoused and they were also using drugs. So we can separate the two, really go together. Marta or Carolyn, do you want to add anything?
I think the one thing I would add is that rather than it being a choice to avoid, which certainly in some cases it is, often we talk to people who had been placed in transitional housing and who had been kicked out because they broke of, various rules. And, one of those rules may have been no visitors, and you had your sister or your mother come and visit you, and you would be kicked out. So, I think it is pretty complex in terms of the reasons.
Yeah, I think he used for some a subset of them. I think he used the expression unhousable due to meth psychosis and extreme drug use, that there's just a subset that are almost unhousable in any sort of contemporary conception of what that might look like. Again, I don't know if that's true with your research, but it was pretty evocative.
Okay, thank you. I have Harvey and then L'Oreal in the chat and Alex.
Right, thank you for a very insightful presentation, and the research design overall really looks fascinating and impressive. I've noticed in Edmonton that there are large encampments, or there have been steadily downtown, and then much frequently smaller ones in other parts of the city along trails, bicycle trails, and elsewhere. Are these smaller encampments different people? Did any of your participants talk about the advantages of location and so on?
They do. So we've heard from many people in Edmonton and in Winnipeg and other places a desire to move away from the inner city to more suburban areas where they feel they are safer, where money generating opportunities like panhandling, flagging might be more lucrative, and where, they simply describe it, I'm thinking of one Edmund quote, as like more quaint, nicer, calmer, away from the inner city. So there's definitely issues such as violence victimization, a desire to desist from the scene in the inner city. These are factors that are driving people more into the suburbs, which may include putting up a tent or a small encampment in different parts of the city. So people do think about the location. And again, safety concerns play a major role in shaping people's decision over where to put up an encampment. There's also, of course, other preferences. We've heard from some people who prefer staying on their own, just with one person, like a boyfriend, girlfriend, where they feel there is greater trust. We've also heard from other people who prefer being in a larger encampment, where some of the things such as sharing chores and organizing the camp simply works more, right? You rely on more people to do the work. So I think it comes down to these, again, like broader factors as well as personal preference.
Hey, thank you. We have tons of questions in the chat now. So I'll take L'Oreal's first. And she's curious whether the participants speak at all about what they think is contributing to the disintegration of the street code in Edmonton. And if so, what were their perceptions regarding this shift?
Or do you want to take it, Marta?
Sure, and you can add if you have anything. So in Edmonton was really the city where we saw the greatest shift in participants' perceptions and experiences of inner city life and violence. We asked people in all the cities whether this was changing in their respective communities, how so. And in Edmonton, it was really shocking and stark. And a huge thing was, of course, the street code. Participants attributed the disintegration to three things. A, an influx of more people. As you know, Katharina mentioned, we've seen the numbers of unsheltered individuals in Edmonton double since 2019. So more people coming in, who knows from where, often might not be familiar with the expectations of the street code, the rules, the norms, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing that we saw in Edmonton was people attribute it to the drugs, where previously street codes did exist and they were quite strong, as Katharina mentioned, although people's need to get more substances so that they don't get sick, so that they don't go into severe withdrawal, override every recognition and emphasis on the importance of the street code. That's one thing that we've also seen. And the third thing that we've seen oftentimes is that some of the local street gangs who particularly have a stronghold or did have a stronghold in Edmonton's downtown and specifically Chinatown communities are also losing a bit of power and respect in the street, particularly as some of the prominent gang leaders in these communities are themselves falling into addiction of the drugs that were previously considered no-go. So the gangs themselves that can typically enforce some of these rules of the streets are also disintegrating, causing just greater chaos and uncertainty. So there's many things going into this, but these are definitely the three strongest themes that we've seen in our data.
Okay, we only have like 5 minutes left. So Alex, and then we're trying to get through through some of the questions in the chat. Maybe you can also type answers if you want to. Alex.
Hi, thank you guys for taking the time to put this together for us. It was very insightful. So at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that there has been approximately 6,000 complaints from the public. Is there a plan in place to engage with the public and get the research findings from this project to them?
Yes, definitely. We always want to make our research findings accessible to the wider public, in addition to institutional actors and government. So we have produced reports and have shared them with wide audiences. We have presented our findings to community-based organizations, and really, I mean, any opportunity to share the findings with actors or the public who are interested, we always try to do that, and we've done that in the past and continue to do that. Thank you.
Awesome. Where would these findings be located, out of curiosity?
Well, they're not, I mean, because they're preliminary reports or reports on the data, we sent them to organizations, especially organizations that work with unhoused community members. So they're not located on the internet or on a particular platform. If anyone is ever interested in accessing one of these reports, you can simply email us and we'd be happy to send you our findings.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Kyla is asking whether you could share your thoughts on policy options or strategies that could encourage a safer drug supply.
Yes, I mean, the main policy suggestion is we need a government-funded safe drug supply, and then access to community-based or government-based treatment options, so people can access free supply, and at the same time also access treatment options if they choose to desist or stop drug use. So not everybody wants to do that or is in a position to do that. So it's important, we need to recognize where people are at and support them where they are at, but providing accessible treatment options, help that is accessible in addition to a safe supply is crucial. And that is really sort of one of the main policy suggestions that has been voiced by, I mean, many people and many advocates too.
Hey, before we wrap it up, because we also have the YouTube channel, I will take the 2 YouTube channel questions. And I apologize to everyone who's had questions and we just couldn't answer it in the time. Thank you so much for your interests. But the 2 YouTube questions are, were there any concerns about coercion, given how much of an incentive you're paying for participation? So double minimum wage for on average, 25 minutes, I guess. And the second YouTube question is, some Indigenous folks I've encountered through work have described encampment life as allowing greater connection to the land, aligned culturally versus market housing. So did this come up at all in your data?
I can start and then pass it on to Marta and Carolyn. So no, I'm not concerned about coercion. I think it is extremely important that we compensate participants as a way to show respect and appreciation for their time. And I think it's important to compensate people adequately, which we hope that $30 is what it's doing. I also don't think it's coercive because people are not pressured to talk to us or to stay with us for a certain period of time in order to be compensated. You can sit down with me for an interview and talk to me for 2 minutes and you'll be compensated $30, or we can sit for 2 hours. So we always leave it up to the participant, first of all, whether they want to talk, where they want to talk, and how long they want to talk, and most critically, like what they want to share and how much they want to share. And that's very clear in our consent forms and sort of the way that we engage with people on a one-on-one basis. For the second, no, I mean, I don't think it's come up like directly, I would say, but maybe Marta and Carolyn, from your observations, because I mean, we're still in preliminary analysis, so I don't want to say no, but just based on what we've done.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And there are some scholars too that have presented these encampments as a form of indigenous-based resistance, reclaiming the land, all of those things. And while these are definitely valid arguments and they might exist for some people on the streets and for some encampments, the individuals that we spoke to across the country so far have not brought this up. The extent of resistance that we've seen, the extent of encampments, or even how they behave on the streets as a form of resistance to colonial violence, all of those things, has just come in very basic responses of, you know, I'm not homeless because this whole thing is my home and I'm in nature and all of those things. But this concept of these camps as a form of particular resistance to these colonial structures and economic structures, we have not encountered that at all.
Okay, then thank you so much for the fascinating talk and for the Q&A. Again, my apologies to everyone who still had questions and we didn't get to them. I'm sure that our speakers would be willing to answer questions via email if you want to get in touch with them. You can definitely find them on the university websites. Again, thank you so much for the talk. And I also want to already alert everyone to our next talk, which will be the last Friday of October. I think that is October 27th. And we will have Vicky Chartrand from the university, from Bishop University with us on that day. We will do the general announcements as we've done for this talk, and we hope that we see many of you again for our October talk. So until then, I hope everyone has a great day, and till next time.
Thank you.
All right, so the live stream is off, so any conversation